If I were to ask you about mechanics that would always stick for years on, yet somehow doesn't seem to get much use, what would it be? Even if we only count from 20 years ago, it's kind of insane to try and remember just how many unique implementations of certain mechanics there were in racing games, but there are some that would only see little use beyond several titles. Thinking about this, there have been some that came to mind and I've been trying to figure out how they work specifically and whether they are completely gone or simply transformed into something different. So I think it would be best to revisit some games of the 2000s and try to look a bit deeper into these mechanics. Need for Speed Carbon to this day is a pretty good game, if not a bit disappointing due to the lack of content and short campaign. But the game also had some outstanding features and mechanics that seem to remain as an exclusive to this day. One of the most memorable pieces comes from the game's iconic canyon duels, something even the game seems to put into some level of importance with its tense opening cutscenes. In the game, these canyon duels perform as the big boss races to really determine who gets to claim the territory, with the added risk of certain death. Now, the mechanics itself is not entirely original, as the concept of canyon duels is partially taken from the Japanese toge races you'd likely have seen from Initial D and some other toge racers. The way it's implemented here, however, is what sets the difference. Usually toge races are about the ability to either keep up or even pass the opposition before the finish line, either downhill or uphill. So you either pass the finish line first or leave the opponent behind so far they're no longer visible. Carbon instead elected to use a scoring system that is measured by how close or far you are from the opponent depending on your starting position, while whoever starts as the follower gets the ability to instantly win if they manage to pass and retain the position. Now, why was this change made in the first place? This is in part due to the AI's capability around these winding canyon roads. You can clearly see they seem to have some insane gravity multiplier, making them look like they're on rails. It is possible to push them off the canyon, but it's definitely hard and done intentionally to avoid players just cheesing them off the mountains. The end result, however, is a set of opponents with very few openings to get a clean pass. It's tense, exciting, but if we were to use regular toge rules, this would be the equivalent of a Dark Souls boss battle. How they are balanced gets a little muddy. See, the first three bosses, Kenji, Wolf, and Angie, are effectively designed in such a way where they can be beaten by lower powered starter cars, primarily because of how you encounter your first canyon duel, being dependent on which starter car class is chosen. This ends up making the first canyon duel be this thrilling and challenging occasion, and then the other two are slightly easier, because at that point you effectively have tier 2 vehicles and some upgrades to make your life way easier. This is why Darius is significantly harder than the rest. Not only is he the final boss of the game, but by this point there are no alternating paths that would warrant some more cautious or open-ended balancing. All they need to do with him is make him hard, not ball-grabbing hard, unless you're doing the starter car challenge for obvious reasons. And they are quite memorable for several factors. They are purely instrumental and they are designed to elevate the intensity. Just two racers and the twisty, winding canyons, in a race that could possibly end in a ride to the grave. Everything they've built to conquer the city being on the line. As the kids nowadays would say, it's peak. So if this mode was so good, why is it only used minimally in the game? We practically only see it 4 times in the main career and only a few additional times in the challenge series. While personally, I think the fact we see so few of them in the game is exactly why they're special. The same reason not every encounter in an action game is going to be intricate or meticulously designed as a boss fight. Imagine if every piece of territory in the career mode has to be finished off with a canyon duel. It would easily lose a lot of its luster. As for why it doesn't seem to get used in other Need for Speeds, while other NFS games wouldn't really see much reason to bring up canyon duels, with each NFS usually trying to be different, to serve brand new ideas. Lore-wise, as far as we know, it's more of a tradition for Palm City street racing culture. Making these canyon duels not only serve as a way to serve up boss battles, but also make it feel more personal. You get attached to how much you hate these characters and their smug expression, so the canyon duels is just easier to serve as a mode where everything goes hard. If there's anything to learn from this one, it's one of the few examples where a limited use elevates its position in our memories. We love canyon duels, not just because it's well designed, but also because it's only used when necessary. Before we continue with the next segment, a quick word from today's sponsor, One State RP. It's a massive open-world mobile game where every single player you see is real. It's set in a modern American city that feels alive and is evolving 24/7. If you want to play as a police officer chasing criminals, then go ahead. Or if you feel like being a criminal mastermind instead, you can do that too. Or you can check out the amazing roster of cars this game has and just enjoy what the city has to offer. But it doesn't end there. There are turf wars between gangs, real estate, underground races, all of this from the comfort of your phone. The devs added a brand new update and they added a full in-game radio system so you can now just cruise around and vibe with the music. There's also a fame system. Everything you do now earns XP, so you can rank up and actually see your benefits and rewards at any given time. The clans can also go to war, or you can work together to take over the city. Hook up with your friends in-game using a referral system, and you can earn yourself rewards and bonuses by inviting your friends. You can support the channel by downloading One State using my link or the QR code on the screen right now. And you can use my promo code or by scanning with your phone to instantly get $10,000 in-game cash. And when you hit level 8, you're going to unlock another $60,000. Use my promo code to get an additional $10,000 bonus instantly on the website. And by using their web store, you can claim daily rewards. Thanks once again to One State for sponsoring this video. On the other hand, Need for Speed also features yet another underrated mechanic that would have been great if it had stayed around. We're staying a little bit with Carbon for this one. Autosculpt was a customization feature added in this game as an alternative, more personalized option. The system gives the ability for players to change certain aspects of the car's bodywork, like adjusting position and sizes of each gap or piece, adding in extra bits like splitters to effectively personalize the way everything looks overall. This feature would see use in some Need for Speed games like Pro Street, Undercover, and Nitro, but after that, nothing. It was even touted as one of the highlight features for Carbon before its release, applicable to side skirts, hood, front and rear bumpers, spoilers, rims, and etc. You can really go wild with this feature even with the slider limits, making a single customization piece take on several alternative looks with the settings. So why is it missing from everything after Need for Speed Undercover? I suppose the most obvious answer that will pop up in here is the end of Black Box, as they were the innovator and effectively handled these features. The moment they stopped making any more underground street racing Need for Speeds, the feature just went out of the window. Additionally, the parts with Autosculpt applied are effectively the body kits that have been around since the Underground title. You know those goofy looking over-the-top body kits in Underground 2, the monstrosities you had to apply for those star ratings? The benefit comes from them being applicable to every car in the game, but that's also the drawback, as each of them are derived from the same visual basis. They did manage to create a bit of gameplay depth in Pro Street. Autosculpt becomes a bit more complicated due to the aero stats, which effectively creates a dilemma where players have to either pick visuals or maximum performance. And then Undercover went back to it being purely visual. I could see them make a comeback with new body kits, but there is another problem if they were to ever bring this back. Obviously, those ones are gonna be untouchable for licensing reasons, but the original ones could certainly benefit from having the Autosculpt feature enabled again. It all comes down to the developers or publishers if they are willing to make the mechanics, coming with the benefits and risks attached, like making the original body kits outright superior to the official license sets. If they want, this could have been used as an alternative aerodynamic tuning in some of the latest Need for Speed games if Criterion or Codemaster ever brought it back. Pursuit Breakers, on the other hand, is something I'm a bit conflicted with. As a feature, it's very useful when used strategically and it looks quite bombastic. The mechanic was at its peak in Mostwanted, primarily because of the importance of pursuit as an activity. As pursuits lost their purpose, it just went away naturally. After Criterion dropped Hopsuit 2010, it was safe to say Pursuit Breakers became unnecessary thanks to the gadgets. Since then, they haven't made a return even in the underground-esque street racing scene since 2015. The less mentality of quantity overload has certainly diminished its usefulness too, since back then it was pretty important when you have 10-20 cops on your tail and you need to escape quickly. Nowadays, the cop AI is somewhat more refined. They're designed to have specific weaknesses and strengths for players to counter, but I do think it at least makes a bit of sense narratively. As much as I like how bombastic they can be, it's hard to ignore the amount of damage that would have to be accounted for here. You're basically a terrorist blowing up gas stations, destroying buildings, and breaking down important structures all over town. At some point, you gotta question why the military isn't dispatched to stomp on street racing completely. I'm not really sure how Pursuit Breakers can work in future titles, but maybe something more subdued is viable. For something a bit less gameplay affecting, what about some music? How many racing games out there actually let you collect samples and create your very own music for the in-game activities? Because at the top of my head, only Kaido Racer seems to come up. Kaido Racer, the second title in the series or the EU exclusive TXR sequel, was the first introduction to custom music systems, and to this day, I still haven't found anything similar to it. The way it's implemented here makes it interesting too, as samples get given out as rewards from winning races against specific rivals. It does bring up the issue of requiring some amount of progression first to make some bangers, but I like that it builds up as everything else progresses. Also, if you really pay attention to the game's default music, you'll notice something peculiar about them. Most of them are built using the same music maker mechanics given to us. Portions of the music are audible as the separate audio sources we can unlock throughout the game. In other words, you can make music in a similar range of quality to the original soundtrack. The cherry on top is having the ability to set them as part of the game's soundtrack. It genuinely astounds me how deep Genki went with this mechanic, even if it were to be quite underappreciated. At its core, this mechanic is completely optional, and most players just decided to ignore it. Some might even dislike it for causing more of the general prizes to be replaced by the audio samples. It's a feature that only a few people heavily appreciate, and even less players actually interact with, so it kinda makes sense why they never brought it up again. I do wish this would come up again in TXR 2025, or if they ever decide to revisit the Toge scene, but considering it would take up manpower and effort that could be spent in developing more important main content, I can understand the absence. During the underground scene, respect was the game. It kinda got annoying back then too, with rep this and rep that, but overall, respect is a mechanic that seems to have faded or simply nerfed to have minimal effect. But the biggest roadblock has always been the way they were designed. Respect in a lot of ways was only used as a way to gate content or feature, which can be used for limiting and setting the pace for progress. The problem was this inconsistent quality of its design. In Saints Row, respect was effectively used as an entry ticket for the main content, and the only way to obtain them was to do the side contents, so interacting with most of the side content becomes unavoidable. In racing games, it's kind of the same way. Juiced also introduced a lot more crews into the mix, and you have to earn the respect of each one individually. The problem with this approach was having to carefully step forward, as each thing you do, which car you bring, how you race, where you place, can impress but also disgust specific crew leaders. It turns the overall progression of Juiced into a constant tug-of-war battle, constantly having to carefully step onto a minefield in order to try and maximize each crew's respect. It wouldn't be so bad normally, but crew respect locks features you'd probably like to check out. The ability to borrow their territory for our own races, challenging their crews to pink slip battles for some higher stakes crew battles, but the system was effectively phased out in the sequel, just like how most other games that used to have respect would effectively try to minimize its effects too. And I feel like there's a perfect middle ground that makes it interesting. Like the prior example of Saints Row's use, it was mostly well received because the side activity there was pretty fun and entertaining, but you also don't have to be a total completionist to get enough respect for every main story mission. In Juice 1, it was just there to give a sense of progression with crews, but the way it's designed to increase and decrease ended up overcomplicating things. But since we're covering Juice, there's another feature that seems to be underrepresented in the genre, but this one is more due to it being a balancing hell. We're talking about pink slip. At the most basic, pink slips are a way to earn a fully built vehicle instantly just from winning events. This is obviously the most common use case, but what happens when players are also challenged to put their own vehicles on the line for it? You get one of the best methods to bring in risk and reward into a racing game ever. The risk is at its highest since you're practically losing your car and any upgrade installed, but if you win, you get the opponent's car, and this is where the problem begins. To facilitate the pink slip bettings, a racing game's economy must also be balanced well enough to maintain a proper challenge, but also remain flexible enough to let players recover at a smooth pace. Nowadays, it's kinda like dying in a Souls game. You may lose a lot of progress, but there's always some way to bring it back. Back then, losing a car in Juice would be a matter of payback, something Juice 2 managed to provide. Don't get me wrong, Juice 1's pink slip mechanic was definitely an okay iteration of it, but I would argue Juice 2 is where this feature is at its best. Everything surrounding the mechanic is done in such a way that it makes everything feel recoverable even when you lose. moves. The fact that pink slip bets are only unlocked after a certain amount of progression, a point where you as the player would at least rack up enough money to have multiple usable vehicles. It also affects the AI opponent by noticeably buffing their capabilities, which makes the pink slip races an easy way to get a more challenging experience than the normal settings. If you ever get beaten though, the opponent will end up using your vehicle the next time around, basically giving you one last chance to recover your stolen vehicle. And this remains relevant until the highest class in the game, so the mechanic is always present throughout, letting players try out different cars they wouldn't have purchased otherwise. While there are other games that would try to do this, the massive effort that would take just to make sure the pink slip system wouldn't break the game makes it one of the most daunting mechanics to really implement. A slippery slope when done badly can cause an entire game to fall apart, especially with online PvP enabled. As far as I'm aware, only CarX Street seems to feature this, and even then it's somewhat flawed in a sense. The mechanic can be easily abused by players with friends to effectively transfer significantly faster cars early and end up breaking the game's speed progression. So it's not a surprise seeing online PvP racing games tend to outright avoid the mechanic. Going back to Duels, there's another feature we should take a look at which also requires some intense balancing, but not as impactful as the pink slips. Intimidation as a racing game mechanic is something I've only seen featured in a couple of games. Generally, it's the ability to make opponents move out of the way by simply tailing them close enough, resulting in some violent crash outs when triggered. There are some games making it something that can also affect you, albeit not as effective, and this is where the balancing issue comes in. Intimidation as a mechanic is only ever relevant if both you or the opponent can always stick very close to one another for a long period of time, which basically means developers can either make the opponent's performance level always scale with the player, but they also need some intense AI pathing put in place. The alternative to this is just by adding in rubber band, but it's going to be significantly more noticeable and annoying. Just imagine having a bunch of AI opponents rubber band up to the point they can drive right in front of you, all just so you get to use intimidation as a mechanic more often. Like, don't get me wrong, this mechanic is cool, but its use case gets rarer and rarer as the game progresses and cars become way more faster and agile. In most cases, you just ignore it to pass the opponent. Like, why would you intentionally slow down in order to screw over one AI opponent when you still have a couple more waiting ahead? But also, the mechanic works in opposition to slipstreaming, something that is way more effective and has more use cases in general. Not only is slipstreaming more streamlined, it keeps the pacing consistently faster, which keeps the racing feel more fluid. It's no surprise to have most game developers drop it in favor of slipstreaming. The mechanic work is slower paced racing events, but not so much when it gets really fast. You just have no room to match the opponent's speed all over the track, just to bully one opponent. The only reason it somewhat works in Juice 2 can be chalked up to alternative goals for progression. It fits the theming of the game since we're effectively some kind of an extreme sports superstar, so you can think of the intimidation goals as a way to rile up the fans and audience to the racing event. And I think these kinds of games are where intimidation can really fit as a mechanic, but it ultimately comes back to how it would be executed. The concept of shortcuts or alternative track routes has been in the minds of racing game designers since the earliest 3D racing game, but for the most part it's usually done in a way to create dynamic strategies or reward players for paying attention to the track. The rarity comes from having an AI manager in charge of shifting the track layout or having players open or close access with specific features in the game, and so far no one has done it in the same explosive manner as Split Second. On the other hand, Grid's 2 version dubbed Live Routes would take more of a behind the curtains approach, being as hidden from plain sight as possible. While both of these games would effectively do opposite methods of track alteration, these two also represent some of the rarest methods used to achieve it. Once it's triggered, be prepared for some Michael Bay explosive production levels, with the track shifting its visual, obstacles, and route. In single player, this mechanic is a treat of spectacle. You get some of the most over-the-top action happening in a racing game, and potentially wreck an opponent in the process. It's not exactly as simple as just activating the power-up for an instant win. Most of the power play will require a proper timing to hit one or multiple targets, and in the case of shortcut activation, a proper understanding of the gate duration and gap between you and the opponent behind is required. In multiplayer, this system is the greatest laugh you can have with a bunch of buddies, or the most frustrating system in the whole genre. Reasoning for this is due to some of the power play moves happening on a linear track, which effectively forces every player behind to go down the same route even if they're left far behind. And if one player ever pulls away from the rest, that person is just downright untouchable thanks to the range limitation of the power play. So as impressive as it is, there's definitely a lot of room for improvements to make here. Too bad a sequel is very unlikely, since Disney decided its developers, Black Rock Studio, was not worth the continued investment. Now for Grid 2's iteration, consideration. Like I said before, it's the complete opposite with a way subtler execution. They're only available in the so-called live races, and the track doesn't exactly change dynamically on the fly. Instead, the track route is generated when entering the event. You can test this by restarting the event after maybe 50 to 90% of the way, and you'll notice the track layout hasn't changed from the last time. Exiting and entering the event, however, will shuffle the track layout all over again. This approach is kind of a good middle ground. It effectively lets you adapt to the current track layout without throwing you some random BS on the next few corners. But knowing the trick ruins the magic of it. This is why they decided to obscure the minimap for this event. If it's there, a lot of people would likely notice the similarities on a restart. So, I'm sorry for ruining it. Its use was also limited to only the city tracks, covering Miami, Chicago, Barcelona, Paris, and Dubai, so only 5 live routes among 14 maps. Though to be fair, I don't think there would be any good way to introduce the mechanics to closed tracks like the Red Bull Ring or Brands Hatch. There just wouldn't be that many alterations to be done there. At the very least, this is quite impressive when it first came out back in 2013. Just like with Split Second's Power Play, this would have been an amazing mechanic if they had built upon it for future grid titles, possibly making the feature into a dynamic on-the-fly change. But even today with Grid Legends, it seems the mechanic is no longer in any reasonable consideration. Even something that feels minor like vehicle switching can sometimes get a bit of spice. It's very rare since the majority of normies audience tends to prefer something like TDU or Forza Horizon style of entrance, an often substitute from the experience of owning and entering these classic or high-end cars. The one time this was ever shaken is by a non-racing game like Driver San Francisco, where the plot follows undercover police and professional wheelman John Tanner, and his ability to basically shift between cars and quite literally put himself in the driver position of any car he can see. Only the twist was he's in a coma, and this power was something he invented while in this state. So the existence of this power is explained by the story, and not just the writer randomly pulling some superhero nonsense into the series. As for its effect on gameplay, shifting becomes the primary challenge to tackle besides driving, as a lot of the missions require some quick thinking from how to utilize shiftable vehicles to fit the situation. Like in the defense missions, where you get to take control of many traffic cars in order to damage opponents, putting Tanner on the seat of a pursuing or escaping vehicle to take direct control, utilizing traffic to create a jam, or some of the later weird extra powers he unlocks in his comatose state. The mechanic as it stands works extremely well in this game, because it fits the narrative role and also benefits the gameplay by giving a lot of room for creativity for both the player and the developers. But if I have to be honest, how do you fit this kind of mechanic in a racing game? Well, the game does have some racing events in it, but it's also the one mode that has the least involvement with shifting. Some ideas I thought of would probably come from manipulating traffic to cause a disruption, but that sounds too basic, or likely to cause the pacing to slow down significantly. The most I've seen something done like this for a racing event are usually in events with multiple cars or crew members, like in Underground Rivals Tag Mode, asking players to shift to another car for the second half of the race, or with Ford Street Racing's crew mechanics, where we can jump between cars in the team race events, while issuing orders to push each car into the highest positions. But speaking of which, crew systems in racing games is probably the one mechanic that are the furthest apart from being underrated in the list. It's likely most of you have at least ran into 1 or 2 racing games with the mechanic available, yet most of the implementation of these mechanics tends to be done in such different ways that the level of enjoyment from these mechanics fluctuates wildly. Like for example, you have the one on Carbon, with crew members having assigned roles, changing how they perform and affect the race, as unbalanced as they are. We then have the Juice titles, where crew members are usually done by replacing an AI opponent with our own, often having to babysit them to make sure they don't get demolished by the competition. That's on top of having to be given our own car for them to drive, increasing the amount of grind and spending for basic victories. But the true underdog comes from the types of crews in Street Supremacy, where we start off only as a member, rising up to the top to be the big chief, before entering the gameplay phase of territorial war with a bit of poaching on the side. It's a system that pushes crews into more than just another aspect of the game, but everything you're building towards. Just compare it to every other crew system. Most either put it as an extra feature or something to pay attention to on the side. Most of them will also place the player in the leadership role from the very start, since we're starting off as a crew member and are required to climb up the hierarchy while also accepting calls for territory defense and attacks whenever the boss needs us. The second half of the game kicks in when we finally become the new crew leader, opening up options of choosing which territory to invade, who to join the crew battles, and which random street racer to recruit into the group. It's like playing 2 different games, and this is probably the most underrated underrated version of a crew system in arguably any game or genre, since most of the time when the system is put in place, the game is very likely to be extremely linear and rigid with its structure or progression, done in a more controlled environment to give more of a cinematic experience. This game instead goes for a complete freedom of choice, with even more options in New Game Plus runs. There's certainly a lot to learn from this game, considering it's not perfect. The fact that crew members are mostly reliant on their static levels means most of the game is about hunting down faster and stronger crew members without any way to significantly develop the ones we already have. It would be cool to see Genki try to tackle this again after the new TXR's full release, if they're willing, but even if they're not, there's a possibility of Night Runner's crew system to be the successor instead. The idea of twin stick controls may have been around since the longest time, but its implementation would usually be used for things like shoot 'em ups and some tank shooter thingy. It's very rarely done in a racing game since most of the time it's used to control steering and camera, but there are very rare examples for this being used to dabble in deeper mechanical skills. Inertial drift is one of the weird examples where drifting relies on both analog sticks, one for the direction and the other for controlling angle. This approach is definitely out there as some weird, unique, and underrated use of twin stick controls, which heavily incorporates other mechanics from throttle and brake controls. I somehow didn't realize each car behaves differently with how they drift, which is just some insane level of detail, so it's absolutely clear they didn't leave any stones unturned for this mechanic. It's just weird how no other game seems to have thought about this, and the other weird thing about this is how the twin stick controls went on unnoticed for the anti-gravity racing scene. The only one I've seen use this is mostly with Redout, an anti-gravity racer series featuring your usual hovercraft like the Wipeout series, but also comes with the additional catch of having an extra air brake control via the right analog stick. This was pretty unheard of since most racers from the subgenre would rather just use the right or left buttons or triggers to enable air brake. Redout instead decides to switch it up by adding vertical controls for air braking. This comes in light to counter certain areas and the G-force involved with these kinds of speed. It's pretty important to avoid the titular redout or blackout phenomenon, which will reduce momentum significantly. Both of these games' implementation of the twin stick controls heavily increases the amount of depth involved for winning, and unfortunately, that's not always a good thing. While it's great for players looking for new and unique ideas, or those tired of the same old safe approach, the amount of depth can be an immensely daunting task to tackle. At the very least, the learning curve for inertial drift is pretty normal since the different cars fill the space for simple to advanced controls, but Redout is the complete opposite. This game is steep, not the price, but the difficulty. Even in the early to mid stages, thanks to the intense speed, mastering the analog air brake becomes crucial, and memorizing spots for it can save a ton of problems with the opponents. So I can see why this isn't as popular for the mainstream audience, but every now and then the appearance of these mechanics are welcome to break the monotony, and they show just how deep racing game mechanics can be when alternative control schemes are introduced. As an addition, the anti-gravity scene also contains one more underrated feature that would come in handy generally, yet somehow this feature has only been done to a handful of games: the ability to drive upside down. It's a bit of a boom when I got to play Grip, considering it was even a bit of a technological marvel with Roll Cage. Mechanically, it allows the developers to create some insane track designs, making use of ramps mixed with a bunch of pipe layouts and some parallel vertical sections. They even get to create some pretty cool symmetrical vehicles that look mirrored for its top or lower half, a limitation that certainly didn't hold them back in variety of designs, or even the weird MG collaboration vehicles, creating some surreal and unusual experiences even for the anti-gravity scene. Yet somehow in the last 20 years, its usage has been very minimal to almost non-existent. Is it because most developers simply try to avoid this due to the technical headaches it could cause, or because most players are simply more familiar with either a Wipeout or F-Zero style of anti-gravity racing? Well, that's the mystery, isn't it? I personally believe it's a bit of both, but otherwise, this is definitely something I would like to see implemented more often, just like the twin stick controls. It's a bit of a crime how underrated the system is, considering it's been around for over 2 decades by now. Role-playing in a racing game is often a rarity due to the many challenges from the core gameplay system. But when it's done well enough, the only thing it could do is elevate the game. Even if a sizable amount of players would rather not bother with it, the crumbs of detail it provides ends up making the world feel a bit more alive than normal. We've seen this as early with the TDU games, for example. The MMORPG aspects it contains lets players on solo or multiplayer sessions to basically experience something outside of the box. The way housing, shops, and dealerships are scattered, mostly to encourage social and role-playing elements. Nowadays, these features still exist, but at a minimal usage, normally done by games like The Crew or Forza Horizon, purely added for function, and as a result, diminishing a lot of the magic that was in the old implementation. We did think Solar Crown would bring this back, but at this point, it's a bit unclear if the future housing update would deliver something similar. This is pretty superfluous compared to most features mentioned, and in some cases may end up causing a game to completely lose its identity due to content bloat. But when it's done right, it really boosts the personality and character of a game. But the change of implementation can also be attributed to players just simply not interacting with everything packaged. It kinda makes sense. Most people just use these houses to do the basic tuning or livery editing over wasting time in an open space without any friends around. On the other hand, what about the idea of making every single traffic car in your racing game into a possible rival? It sounds daunting at first, but it doesn't really have to be over the top where every single one of these traffic cars would have to have their own personal writing and characterization, mind you. And we've seen this implemented mainly by Japanese game developers for their specific systems. The one most people are aware of comes from the recent TXR, with the ability to challenge every single car you meet on the road. A delivery truck, challenge them. A soccer mom, challenge them. A taxi on the job. You bet we're challenging them. It's like the entire population of Japan has this unspoken code of honor. If a street racer flashes you, you raise them. In the case of TXR, this is very useful to rack up win combos to boost income multipliers, especially when the named crews and rivals are way too far apart from each other. It's just very convenient as a mechanic, and it also creates some super goofy moments when your souped up Suzuki Swift ends up getting smoked by a taxi of all things. The other game to pull this off was Racing Lagoon from way back in 1999. Now that game is more of an RPG with racing mechanics, replacing the usual Final Fantasy-esque turn-based combat, so making the traffic cars into random rivals was a bit expected, since they effectively replaced random combat encounters. Additionally, in that game's case, it was designed in such a way to create this scavenger hunt experience, since winning lets us loot the opponent's parts, making some of the rare spawning enemies into very desirable targets for bullying. Even in the writing, it made a bit more sense, with how popular street racing was as an activity and culture of the game's world. So everything about this implementation was just super solid. It's not really applicable to every game, since most games' traffic are simply designed as obstacles, which often doesn't really get much attention to detail. Heck, some of the traffic cars are often just whatever free assets that were available, so it's understandable why they don't implement the mechanic more often. Kinda like RPG mechanics. Stuff like leveling and completely separate equipment systems, which can sort of fit in racing games in a sense. Most of the time though, it's only done for the driver equipment. In return, it helps by adding special effects and improving on handling stats. It's a good workaround since racing games technically already got an equipment system with car upgrade parts. The only racing game to go the full way has only been Racing Lagoon. Leveling in a racing game, on the other hand, has been a simpler affair. It's usually done in a way to limit what cars players are allowed to acquire or drive. When balanced well, it gives off a level of progression just from the sense of speed. The rare part comes from when developers decide its use should be expanded. It's almost as rare as a good use of fuel in these racing games. Add some more interaction with pit stop minigames. Like seriously though, when was the last time you played a game with this mechanic included? Maybe from a somewhat recent indie game and a few other examples from ages ago. I get that nowadays people just shrug or eye roll when QTEs get involved anywhere, but I still think this was one of the few times it can really enhance the experience. But I think that should be it for this time. There's a bunch of other obscure or underrated mechanics I'd like to cover and analyze, but they'll likely take forever to go through. So why don't you leave down your favorite mechanics from any of these racing games, or maybe even one of those action driving games down in the comment section below. It's always nice to hear or learn from some of you with more knowledge on specific things like these, so don't be shy to put something down there. Also, if you enjoyed this video, why not try out the underrated mechanics of pressing the like and subscribe buttons, as it helps out this video and the channel a lot. Either way, I'll see you in the next video.